All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our little virtual event space. My name is Allie, and I will be your host for this evening. I am so excited to be introducing Jason Schreier and Matthew Seiji Burns here to discuss Jason's new book, Press Reset. So before we get into the fun stuff, I just want to quickly thank you all so much for tuning in and for buying books. Your support really is what keeps us going, and we really love what we do. So if you also love what we do, we would so appreciate it if you swing by and grab some copies, or if you're not local, we do ship. Shipping is just $3.50 for the first book and $1 for every book after that. And I will be linking books in the chat all evening, so they should be easy to find. So while you are over on our website, I definitely recommend checking out some of our other upcoming events or sign up for our newsletter. It's just a weekly update about events and exciting releases, our online book clubs, and of course, you can follow us on any of the major social media platforms. We are at Third Place Books for the quickest updates and recommendations. And we do have some fun over on our social media platforms. So definitely go and see what is up with that, see if there's anything over there for you. So we are here for about an hour, and towards the end, we will be taking questions. So if you have any questions, which we very much hope that you do, go ahead and leave those in the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom or at the top of your screen, depending on your device. It is different than the chat box, which is also very fun. Go ahead and use the chat for virtual applause and connecting with each other. But when it comes time for questions, definitely make sure that those end up in the Q&A, just so that they are easier for us to find. And I believe that that is all of my housekeeping. So without further ado, I am so thrilled to introduce Jason Schreier, the best-selling author of Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, and of course, the book of the evening, Press Reset. He is a reporter at Bloomberg News, where he covers the video game industry and has spent 8 years at Kotaku, one of the biggest video game websites in the world, as well as covering games for Wired and contributing to a wide range of outlets, including the New York Times, Edge, Paste, Killscreen, and the Onion News Network. His newest book, Press Reset, he trains his investigative eye on the volatility of the video game industry and the resilience of the people who work in it. So in conversation tonight, I'm so happy to welcome Matthew Seiji Burns, who is a writer and game developer. He recently created Eliza, an award-winning visual novel set in Seattle about an AI-assisted therapy tool. He wrote and composed for Opus Magnum, Exapunks, Shenzhen IO, and The Writer Will Do Something, a Twine game about being a writer on a AAA game. He has been a producer who worked on the Destiny, Halo, and Call of Duty franchises, as well as educational scientific discovery games for the UJEB. And with that, welcome, both of you. I'm so excited to listen in on this conversation. If you need anything, give me a shout, and that goes for the audience as well. I will be in chat listening in, and I think I leave you all in their capable hands. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that lovely, lovely introduction, Allie.
Yeah, it's great to be here and speaking with you about your new book, which
Yeah,
is
I don't know if people know this. I don't know if this is a commonly known fact, but I believe you are possibly the first person ever to have read both of my books so far. Like, I think you are the first person to complete them, because what I've done with both books is I finished a draft. Maybe my editor read pages, but not the whole thing. I finished a draft and I wind up sending it to like a select group of friends and family and my wife and stuff like that for what's called beta readers, which are like beta testers except readers. And you both times so far have been, first of all, gracious enough to read early copies and give me your feedback, which has been awesome. But also, you finished them both like in a single night, both
yeah.
times, which is amazing. So you were like really the first person to finish reading both manuscripts. So
Well,
congrats.
I do because they're really riveting to me. You know, the game development stories that are in them are not only very interesting just on their own, They're also very relevant to me as a game developer, right? You've written about people that I know, teams that I know, games that I have worked on. So it's very, very interesting to read your take on them, and how um, how it looks to you, which is, sometimes it's different, right? Between how it looks when you're trying to figure out the entire picture versus someone who is in the team, right? As like one person on the team. And that's actually something that I was interested to talk to you about, which is like um, game development. I think is hard to understand, right? Because it's something that takes place um, among a lot of people, especially on AAA teams. It's there are hundreds of people who work on these games, and so how do you tell the story of how the game was made, right?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I was just doing some reporting on the new Bethesda game because someone had reached out to me about it, about Starfield, and I was very curious about the release dates because there were a bunch of rumors and blah 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 blah. And something that I found really interesting while I was reporting on this, and I always kind of knew this, but it's always just like illuminating to hear it out loud, is that like people who worked on the game like had no idea what like the bigger picture was because they're so like hyper focused on their own thing. So it might be like that someone and then to just kind of like talk more broadly, someone might not know like when their game is actually coming out. They might have just like heard vague notions, but like it was never actually communicated finally to anyone, or like they have some vague notion, but they don't know if it was delayed and nobody actually told them, or maybe they'll find out when it's announced at E3. And it's just these teams are so humongous, like hundreds of people, like you mentioned, thousands of people sometimes, that it really just is like a bunch of little people in their own siloed worlds, like trying to figure out what's going on and like working on their little pieces. And I guess it makes sense that like if you are working on, I don't know, if you're in the visual effects department and your job is to like make all the guns look pretty when they shoot and do all the effects that come out of the guns, then do you really need to know like the big picture of the project, or do you just need to know like when your Jira tasks are need to be finished and stuff like that? So
Right,
yeah,
right.
it's
And
it's it's interesting.
that definitely comes out, I think, both like in your work and also in reactions to your work, right? And stories that I've heard also just from other people, which is like you are talking to someone who worked on a really big game, and they say, oh, it was awful, we crunched terribly, and it was a terrible time. And then you talk to someone else who also worked on the exact same game, but they were in a completely different part of the company or something like that, and they go, well, I had a great time, like I didn't crunch at all and my team was really good. So there can be a stark difference in people's experiences even on the same team, and I'm kind of
Yeah.
curious how you reconcile that, when you talk to, say, 10 people out of a 100-person team, and they have such different, they have just such different takes on what happened. How do you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean that's true of small teams too. Like
Right. Yeah.
if you're five people, you can probably get five different perspectives, like five different opinions on
Right.
how awful everything is. And one guy is crunching because they're working from home, and they never have a commute where they leave the office, and so they're constantly working, and nobody's there to tell them to go home. So they suddenly burn out, and they're like, oh my god, this is the worst project. And then someone else is like in their office having a great time. Yeah, you never know. It's interesting. It's a tough challenge as a reporter to get the bigger picture when you have so many disparate perspectives. And I think, at least for me, one of the things that I try to do when I'm reporting is find the common threads and make sure that like I'm hearing the same thing from multiple people before reporting on it. And then it's also kind of like I wouldn't say that this project like was super crunchy for every single person on it in the same way that I wouldn't say that I try to avoid saying like this company doesn't crunch. And I think I try to make it a little I try to make it clear to readers that it's more complicated than that, and that like crunch comes in different shapes and forms, and it can look like all sorts of different things, and it can be voluntary or not voluntary, and who, blah blah. You
Mhm.
know how this works. It's a very nebulous concept of working overtime, and like it's all very complicated. But point being that like if I talk to one person and they are crunching hard, it doesn't necessarily mean that this company has a really bad culture of crunch. It might just mean that this person is having a really bad time of it. Maybe they're blocking someone else and they feel bad about it, or maybe their team is hit pretty hard for whatever reason. Whereas if I talk to a bunch of people and they all share kind of like a common story about like, oh well, this is the type of place where you're in the office and everybody's in the office and you see all the cars parked outside at 8 p.m. and if you leave at 7:30 you get dirty looks from everyone. That kind of tells a different story than the hey, I was working really hard on this project. And then also, I mean, it's important to kind of do your due diligence as a reporter and just try to talk to as many people as possible. Try to make
Mhm.
sure they're from different disciplines and cross sections of groups. One of the things I try to do when I'm reporting on pretty much anything is I try to make sure that I'm not talking to people who are like all part of the same clique or friend group at one of these big companies, because that I think can be dangerous as well. If like everyone is telling you similar things, sometimes it's almost like a red flag if multiple people are using similar phrasing about someone, or like about a like they're all saying something similar that is very specific, like a very specific turn of phrase to describe the company's culture or like the
Mm.
person they work for. And so then you have to kind of reach out and try to talk to as many other people as possible. But yeah, I mean, it's not easy. And
Right.
there are certainly times when I've reported something and then heard from someone else who is like, oh, that doesn't reflect my experiences at all. And that to me is interesting, and I think makes me very wary of trying to claim that anything is going to be super comprehensive.
Right. Yeah. The thing that you said about speaking to people who kind of use the same phrase to describe someone is really interesting, because certainly one of the takeaways that I took from AAA game development was that it can be a pretty um, political process. Sometimes it can be a kind of a factional process, right? Where there are
Mm-hmm.
some people who really want the game to be this one way, and then there are another group of people who really want the game to be another way, right?
Right. There's some
And
people at Bungie who want it to be Halo, and some people who want it to be World of Warcraft.
right, exactly, right. There are differing philosophies, right, of game
Yeah.
design, and sometimes those also turn into kind of personal grudges as well,
Uh-huh.
right? And I think that
And
like
again, all this could describe
if
any industry, not
oh,
just
well,
games.
that's
So
true.
yeah.
Yeah, right. It's true of any, especially creative industries
Mm-hmm.
where there's a lot at stake, which games is one. I think that it's kind of funny because like there, if you think about like what are the motivations to speak to someone like you about their experience, right? I think one that comes up a lot is like I want to tell my side of the story. Like
Mm-hmm.
here, I want to talk about why the game didn't turn out the way I wanted it to, or not as good as I wanted it to be. Or I was wondering if you see that sometimes in the people who come talk to you, like they want you to tell the story a certain way.
So most of the time, it's me approaching people rather than the other way around, and so it's them kind of like being like, "Oh, well, Jason's already working on this. He already knows this. Maybe I'll talk to him about this thing as well." And then yeah, a lot of it is like I want to tell my side of the story. I think a large part of it actually is, you'll appreciate this, as someone who made a game about therapy. People use me as therapy and find it
Oh my
cathartic to just
goodness.
share their stories with me. I've
Uh,
had this conversation with a few people recently where it's like, hey, I feel like I'm talking to a therapist right now, and I'm like, hey, it's
wow.
free, so enjoy it. Just complaining, getting on the phone with Jason and complaining.
Right, right.
But yeah, I mean, it depends on the story, right? Like oftentimes when I get someone reach out to me, like a tipster or a whistleblower or whatever, it's because it's not necessarily because they want to explain like why something went off the rails. It's more that they want to expose something. So it's like, hey, things are really rough here. I'm hoping that an article will change that in some way.
Mhm.
Whereas when I'm working on a book like Press Reset and I'm telling all these stories about like people's studio shutdowns and people's experiences with studio shutdowns, I think that a lot of people either want to tell their side of a certain story and like share their experiences about a certain company, or just kind of help make things better, and can hopefully feel like they can do so by being transparent and honest, and kind of like the whole learn from the history so you don't repeat the same mistakes thing. I think a lot of people see it that way too, and I think that's why some people talk to me for articles as well. Is like, if this goes in the public record, if the story of why Anthem failed goes in the public record, and everyone can kind of see like this is not how games should be made, then maybe it'll help people from repeating the same mistakes in the future. And I don't know how successful that is, because of inertia and all the other, and nobody knows better ways to do certain things. But
Right.
that's I think a lot of people's hope.
Right. Yeah, I think that it's interesting to see. By the way, this reminds me, Press Reset is an official New York Times bestseller. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Still kind of
Um,
shocking, but yeah.
I'm excited about that, not just for you, but also because it means that people are interested in game development stories,
Hmm.
which I find very heartening personally. I
Yes.
think
Yeah.
that
I'm hoping it leads to
um,
like a wave of new game books.
yeah,
Um,
I hope so too, because like I think for a long time people who didn't make games just kind of assumed games came out of nowhere, right? They just
mhm.
fell from the
Magic.
sky, completely finished or maybe half finished.
Yeah.
But you know, there wasn't much of a sense of like what really went into it. There wasn't much of a sense of not just the technical and design challenges, but the personal challenges, right? The emotional challenges and the struggles that people actually have um, with each other, with their own lives in trying to make these things. So it's not just a matter of, will the technology work? Will the design be good?
Hmm.
Will it look good and run well? You know, it's there's also a huge factor of this kind of human element, which I think your book really gets into. It's about the people who make the games more than it is about like, should we do this or that? Should we design it this way or that way? It's really a lot more about like uh, moving cross country to join a new studio, which I think is still very common even in this post. I don't want to say post, in this pandemic, sorry,
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
Like lots of people that I know are still moving for jobs and have to move every 2 or 3 years in some
It's a
cases.
bummer.
Yeah, and relocate themselves because that's kind of just what you have to do when you work in the game industry. And I think that the
Hmm.
book actually really hits that home when you're reading all these stories of the different people who uprooted themselves
Hmm.
uh,
It's
time and
kind of
again.
like,
Yeah,
why do people do this? Why does anyone make games?
right.
Um,
Yeah, it's I think it's a testament to one of the reasons that the game industry kind of skews younger, even though it doesn't have to skew as young as it does because it's actually a pretty venerable industry by now.
mhm.
Which is just that like after a certain point, it just gets hard physically to keep up with it. Not just crunch time, but also like the willingness to relocate
Yeah.
and other things like other factors like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that most game developers, at least in my experience, would agree that like that's the thing that burns them out. That's the thing that leads people to leave, is the layoffs and the volatility, and like not knowing that you might like when you get into your 30s, you might want to have kids, you might want to have a family, you might have a partner, you might have roots in a city. Like knowing that you might have to just pack up and leave, that's what really drives people out. Because like people, I mean, uh, despite all the conversations about crunch in the industry, like that's something that you can deal with in a lot of ways, and especially when it's manageable. And like most companies these days are not doing the death march, like years of extended crunch. Like most of the time it's like it's manageable, unless you're at like one of the few companies that's like really known for crunch culture, in which case they just leave. But like really it's like for all of the games industry's problems, and a lot of them are solvable problems that need to be fixed and like need to be dealt with, volatility is really the big one. That at least as far as I see it. I mean, is that a sense that you get from your game developer friends as well?
I think, yeah, I think it is, and I think it's like there are a lot of people who I think get into a certain number of years in the industry and actually decide they don't necessarily want to do it anymore. I think it's pretty common for game developers who've been working for 10, 15, 20 years to move into maybe an adjacent space sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
There are people in your book
Go to
who do this,
Facebook, make some
people who,
money. Yeah.
right, the programmers go and they take a programming job at not a game company and make a lot more money and crunch less. The people who are not programmers might, become a graphic designer, or they might go and teach game development instead of trying to make games and, of their own. And so these are all like things that seem to happen quite a bit, I think, because the industry itself, especially when you're working on big AAA games, it really does kind of wear on you after a while. And you kind of need to, if not leave, you have to, I think, have a backup plan at least, when things just don't work the way they used to.
Yep. Yeah, it's funny. Usually people have backup career plans when they're trying to make it in something. Like you got Hollywood, you want to be a director, a film director, and you're like, I have a backup plan in case this doesn't work out. In games, you need a backup plan even when you're successful at it, which is sad.
Right. Yeah. There's a funny quote from the director of Neo in a little documentary made about him that I saved. I forget his name off the top of my head, but he said something like, the game was successful, which meant we had to make another one. And he has this very sad look on his face. But it's true. When you make a game that people like, you have to do it again. And that sometimes that can not necessarily be, sometimes it's not the happiest thing. It's like, wow, I have to go through that entire thing again. And there's a weariness, sometimes that that appears.
Yeah, well, I mean, it just feels like there needs to be a better way to do this. Like, I kind of like when my first book with Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, I kind of wrote it from this detached perspective of like, okay, I'm just gonna let all these people speak for themselves and let readers come to their own conclusions. And I would say, like, anecdotally, I've said this before, but like anecdotally, like 50% of the people who read the book were like, I want to be in game developer now. I want to be in the games industry. And 50% were like, I will never be in the games industry ever. I think with Press Reset, the numbers will skew a little bit more towards the latter. But also what I tried to do with this book was kind of take a stronger stance against some of these things and make it a little bit clearer that like, this is not okay. And I thought with the first book that, more people would come away from it realizing that it was a book full of cautionary tales more than like instruction manuals on how games should be made. But yeah, I mean, I always wonder writing this stuff and hearing about this stuff and just hearing story after story, like, is there a better way to make games? There must be a better way to make games.
Yeah, that's the perennial question, I would say, that like anyone in games asks themselves. So your book is mostly a series of tales of game development, right? All of the beginning chapters are tales of game development without necessarily a lot of editorializing. I think you save most of that for the last chapter, right?
Yeah.
The last chapter, it sort of discusses ways we might try to improve the way games are made and how we can make games without killing ourselves at the end. And I think that, first of all, yes, absolutely, there's a lot of improvement that should happen. There's also a lot of improvement that hasn't happened over the years. I want to share a story about a studio that I worked at, one of the very first studios. Maybe I won't say the name, but it was a game studio making a big AAA game. I guess it's already public what AAA games I worked on, so you can figure it out. But I worked on a big AAA game once, and it was bad. And there was a letter from the management that went out to everyone on email that said, we can't do this again. Like we understand that this was
it was bad. You mean the production, not the game?
The production, yeah, correct. Yeah, the game turned out fine and sold amazing because it's a AAA game. But the management said, like, we know that we can't do it this way again, and we're going to be smart. We're going to like invest in more people. We're going to invest in better processes. We're going to be smarter about scheduling, and we want to make this a sustainable place to work, right? And so getting that email from the bosses, and then I left for other reasons to go to another job, and I worked in the game industry for another 15 years. So 15 years passed. And then I saw a an article, I think it was in Kotaku, which
Yeah, it
was
was.
here's a letter that the management of a studio sent to their employees, and it was someone had sent Kotaku the email, so they reprinted it, and it was the same studio that I had worked at 15 years previously,
Got it.
and the email said, we can't do this again. We know that that was really bad for all of us. What we're going to do is we're going to put in new processes and things so that this doesn't occur again.
Of course.
And so I had this really, vertiginous moment of feeling like, wow, 15 years later, the exact same studio. The email was from someone that I had worked with back then,
Of
and
course.
he was now the big boss. He was he was like a coworker at the time, and now he's running the place, and kind of saying the same thing that I remember them saying 15 years ago. So I think that when we talk about potential solutions, and I know you've proposed some in your book, I think it's easy for a lot of veteran game developers, especially AAA game developers, to be cynical about the chance for change, right? In game developer discussions, when things like unionization comes up, or like more granular outsourcing, some of the things that you talk about as potential solutions, there's a lot of like dubiousness and like, well, that would never work because of this reason or that reason, or things like that.
Yeah.
You know?
Because it's not what we're used to. I have a few thoughts. First of all, on that point, I mean, this is something that, so I was at Kotaku for 8 years, and certainly towards the end of my career at Kotaku, I fell to the classic trap of like, well, this is how we've been doing it, so this is how we should do it. And it was only with some distance that I was like, man, why was I so stubborn about that? Part of it is just like, when you've worked at some place, or in this case in a field, for so long, you just wind up thinking that you know everything, and that like there's no other way to do it, and it's just that kind of like human hubris that is so common in so many different industries. So I think that's one factor there. I think another factor is that the people who I'm guessing that if you looked at the credits list of the game that you worked on 15 years ago at that company, I'm guessing a large chunk of those people are no longer in the games industry, or at least no longer at that company.
Correct,
and I think what happens is that because of the problem we discussed earlier, the attrition, and the fact that this is such a young person's industry, I think the people who have the experience and like have been through this before are gone, and so it's a bunch of new people who like are just going through it again, like going through the experience for the first time and don't know any better, and are just like, oh god, wow. So that's the other thing, is like people just making the same mistakes because there are no veterans to stop them from making those mistakes. And then the third thing, I think, and I talked a little bit about this in Press Reset, specifically while talking about Bioshock Infinite's development, I think that like when you're going through hell on a AAA project, it's usually the last year or so of development, and then after that, the last thing you want to do is go back to work. So you wind up just coasting for a while, and maybe 2 years later, you've had like a great time in pre-production for all this time, and then it's suddenly like, oh god, we have an E3 milestone coming up, and then suddenly we're off to alpha, and then beta, and content complete, whatever it is, and suddenly you're in hell again, and it's just this never-ending cycle, because nobody wants to like go back after they shipped a game and be like, all right, now we're really gonna like get our shit together and fix these tools and fix these processes. Everyone wants to just coast for a while and just like spend some time in happy dream pre-production land, right? So that's another thing, I think.
Yeah, I would say that there's a certain element of that for sure. Yeah, there's definitely people don't want to work super hard right after rolling off of a very difficult project. At the same time, like, it's not like people don't know that they're going to need the tools, right? Like there is a certain sense of, to me, there's still a mystery of why in a typical like 3-year AAA cycle, for example, that first year is always just it's always just gone, no matter how seriously you do try to take it for whatever reason. Like you said, the last year, especially the last 9 months, is really when the game is actually made for all intents and purposes, at least in my experience. And the first the first year, and especially even the first 2 years, are kind of like they can really go by very fast, like just playing around with prototypes, or like, oh, we're going to change the art style, or what if we made it open world? Oh no, we're not going to do
Yeah,
that, or
or this
something
thing
like
isn't
that.
fun, so we have to scrap this and
Right,
start over again. And
right.
and I mean, from what I've heard, that sort of thing can happen like pretty late, also, where like you realize
It
something isn't
can.
fun.
I think it's so. I think it's a fair question. Like, I think it's still a completely open question. Like, why that happens? Like, why does a team need to spend that year kind of playing around with like vehicle sections that aren't fun? Or so, there's always like some sort of boondoggle that like someone wants to do, or like people think is going to be like kind of like the next big thing, and it doesn't quite work right, and it stumbles along for a really long time before it gets cut, or it kind of works and gets into the game. Either way, like that is a kind of a weird rhythmic thing that I think can't be fully explained just by like people don't want to work that first year, because they
Right.
do, right? And people aren't dumb. Like they know that like it's gonna, that they should make smart tools. Like people know that like the tools should be good. They know that it's going to come down to the wire, so it would be great if everything works, but still it doesn't quite come together. And I think that that's a really interesting thing to maybe think more carefully about at some point. Like, why does it do that way when it's, again, these people have been through it before, they know how it works, but it still sometimes gets that way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even necessarily think it's because people don't want to work. I think it's just because people think this is how you do it. There's a quote
Sure,
in the
yeah.
book from Ken Levine, who is, I mean, considered one of the auteurs of the video game industry, certainly someone who's been making games for 30 years. There's a quote from him in the book, and he said this, I believe, at a Eurogamer convention, where he talks about, this is me paraphrasing, but he essentially says, like, the way you make a game is you spend 2 years dicking around, and then you make the game in like that final year. And
Right.
I don't think it's like because people are lazy. Like I don't think the Redditors are right that game developers are all lazy. I think it's more because like that's seen as the way to do it, is just like you spend all this time dreaming things up and iterating and brainstorming, and that's how you make a game. And it's kind of funny when you look at AAA especially, that people think that way, because they always wind up falling into the same formulas anyway. It's always like, let's spend 2 years dreaming things up, and then, oh, okay, it's a cover shooter with a skill tree
Mhm.
and quest objectives on your mini map. And that to me is really funny, and just kind of, again, hubris in action. But I think it's just human nature. It's like, you think that you're a game developer, you're in AAA, you're part of this machine. Part of it also is that, like, of the hundreds of people who work on these games, like, how many are actually making decisions? It's like a few at the very top, director level people, maybe a couple of producers, and making high level decisions, but most people are not getting any say in this. So like, they're told like, okay, we have a lot of time, so we're gonna think about things for the next whatever, spend some time brainstorming, spend some time prototyping, whatever. But yeah, but I think it's really just like as simple as, this is how it's been done, and so this is how it is done, and it's the only way we all know how to ship games. And that is like, again, I just feel like some people out there just need to be challenging all of these notions, and I'm sure there are. But yeah,
Yeah,
that's the question I always ask, like, why does it have to be this way?
I can see that. And I think that one of the things that happens, at least that I've seen, is that there's kind of a muscle memory, especially if you especially if the team kills itself and then the game that comes out is extraordinarily successful.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really bad pattern, because then you sort of associate in your brain, it's very hard to break that. You associate great success with
Yep.
killing yourself, and then it's very easy to believe that. And this happens in any, right, this happens with authors, this happens with musicians. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you do something that's not very healthy, but then you produce something that becomes successful, while whatever that habit is, whether that's crunching or substance abuse or whatever
Yeah.
else, right?
Yeah.
Like, then you start to believe that's part of your process, and you start to
Mm-hmm.
think, well, I have to do this in order to make something successful.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be a very dark pattern in terms of like people's psychology. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like that's definitely something that happens in certain game studios.
It
That would
sure
all be
does.
very interesting to get into. I think if you were going to explore further stuff, right, for like a future book or something like that. Like the psychology of all that, you know, is fascinating to me. I don't know if you've ever, like you said, people treated you like a therapist. I wonder if like if you ever, you know, thought about like the psychology of game development, or like what happens to people, you know,
I
in
want
these
you to write that
situations.
book. I want to read that book from Matthew Seiji Burns. No, yeah, I actually have an idea for my next book, but I'll tell you it off air.
Okay. All right.
Because I don't want
That's,
to share it just yet, not finalized just yet. But it's not. It's more of like a story, a big story, as opposed to like a theme
I see.
book. But yeah,
Okay.
no, it is interesting, like the psychology of like people who work in games and people who just like, especially people who just keep going on the AAA treadmill. And I mean, what I've found is that a lot of people don't want to do that, and like it burns them out, and they go indie instead because they don't want to be part of the machine. They don't want to be cogs in it, and like at a certain point, the prestige of like of seeing your name in the credits as rigor for on
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Call of Duty,
Totally.
whatever, is not worth the all the sacrifices you have to make to put that out the door. And especially these days when there's like so much venture capital money and investments flowing around in the indie space, and so many companies like Epic who are investing in indies, it just feels like it's easier than ever for people to go and take that path, or like for some talented developers to just be like often contracting in addition to like pursuing their own projects. And it feels like there are a lot more options these days, and so not everyone has to go on the AAA treadmill
Mm-hmm.
in the way that they would have had to even 15 years ago when you were coming up. Like that was probably the only way to really get
Right.
into game development.
Yeah, there's definitely a much bigger like indie scene, and like an indie business that you can do, right? That's very much more viable these days than it used to be. Um, that's not to say that indie can't also be stressful, right, in its own way. I think you
Yeah,
talk
but
about this
different,
in
very different
in
kinds
your
of
book,
stresses. Yeah,
right?
definitely.
Yeah, there's an indie studio, the Molasses Flood, that creates their own game, The Flame and the Flood, and it wasn't as successful as they wanted it to be, right? And that's something that can hit pretty hard, especially when you're a small team, especially when you've got a lot invested in a lot of yourself invested in the game.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Arguably in AAA, sometimes you can zone out of your own personal contribution to it because it's, well, I'm just doing this. This is my job, right? Sometimes you don't have to get yourself all tied up in it. But an indie game, sometimes if you make an indie game and you pour your heart and soul into it and it doesn't sell very well, that can be
Yeah.
very tough in its own way.
Yeah, no,
Um,
totally. But the scale is so much lower that like your definitions of success are much different than they were in
that is
AAA.
true.
And
Yes.
like a single good spike, like a good Christmas sale, could suddenly get you into the black, and like suddenly you're fine and you broke even on this game. So it's definitely risky and riskier certainly than having a stable job where a corporation is paying for your health benefits and stuff. But yeah, I mean the rewards can come in different ways, in different forms.
Yeah. So I think it's a matter of, I mean, I think a lot of people who have longer careers in the game industry have done stints of multiple uh, ways of working, whether that's in AAA or mobile sometimes,
Mm,
or you know, more social casual games, and just being open to working on those types of games, like different types of games and in different capacities. Because I
mm.
think whether it's going between AAA and indie, or like teaching a class or something like that, just changing it up, I think is important. And a lot of the people who I've seen survive for a long time in games are people who can be a little bit more fluid in terms of like their working style and what they work on and how they work and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've noticed that as well. I think like resiliency is a certain trait, you know, that you can cultivate.
Yeah, I mean, you have to if you're going to be bouncing around between jobs all the time the way that you need to in order to keep a career in games. I mean, that's the thing that like really strikes me and is one of the kind of inspirations that led to Press Reset, is that there's so few people who are like, I've spent more than 5 years at a single company. Like it's so uncommon. And like occasionally you'll see a company where it's full of people who are proud to have their like Blizzard sword and shield, and they've been there for a long time. But that's so rare in games. It's just like it feels like more often than not people are just leaving every 3 years every time their game ships, because either they got laid off or their studio shut down, or they just can't like deal with it anymore. And that to
Mm.
me is really a striking thing about game development that is super depressing, and just keeps making me ask. And I feel like, to your point earlier, by the way, I was thinking about this, about like more game books and more stories about like how these games are made. I actually think, and I mean I guess I'm biased here, but I think that it's important to have an outside perspective, like someone who doesn't make games, or multiple people who don't make games. And occasionally I'll get some like shitty comment from a game developer or whoever who's like, oh, you've never done this, like you don't know what it takes, blah blah blah. And I think it's really important for someone who hasn't done it and doesn't know what it takes to look at it and be like, what the hell are you guys doing? And just kind of provide that perspective of not being in the middle of things and just hearing all these stories. And it also helps to just be able to just kind of offer this detached point of view that is like, I am compiling these different stories. I can hear all these different accounts and kind of try to tell a fair story, a fair version of the story, a fair and like honest version of the story. And yeah, I mean, I think a reporter's job in this space is helpful
Mhm.
and hopefully does some good as
Yeah,
well.
I agree with that. That I think that like having that perspective is very useful, and it's why I read your book so fast. I guess is because like they're fascinating to me in both of ways of like seeing things, stories that I thought I was familiar with, but with new perspectives and different information, just by talking to people that I wouldn't have spoken to, and telling parts of the story that I hadn't known. And like you said, I think like it's sort of the same mechanism of where you're forced to explain why you're doing something to
Hmm.
someone. Sometimes that brings up things that you never realized, like, whoa, why am I doing it that way?
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah. And then sometimes you can't even answer the question. You're like,
Right, exactly.
wait a minute,
Yeah,
what?
exactly. Yeah. So I think it is I think it is a valuable perspective to have, to for someone to try to explain game development that's happening based on everyone trying to explain it to you,
Uh-huh.
right? It I don't know. To me, it's endlessly fascinating, because even when you work as a producer on a AAA game, which was the role that I was at some of the places that I worked, producers are supposed to have like kind of um,
A high level
a
view.
high level view, and they're supposed to sort of understand how the different pieces fit together and things like that. But certainly I never felt like I had a great amazing view of how where this game is
Interesting.
going, and stuff like that. Like I could see some things on a technical level, but there were so many other things going on. There was decisions made that I had no idea about, right? There were uh, the aforementioned like kind of factions, people like don't like each other, and like are running like weird internal battles against each other and all. there's
Uh-huh.
there's like 1,000 small stories in every AAA game, or in any game really, that could be told. So it's really interesting to kind of try to tell the story in a cohesive way, and I think that that's the value for sure of what your book does.
Yeah, I think the thing that's also striking to me about AAA game development is how thin the line is between a masterpiece and a total failure. And like you hear this a lot from game developers. I think Bruce Straley talked about The Last of Us and how until the very last minute they thought that game was going to be a complete disaster, and then it comes together and it becomes like an all-time classic. I think something similar happened on God of War a couple of years ago, and then something else similar happened on Cyberpunk, and it turned out to be a disaster because it just didn't have that extra time, and it didn't have that extra bug fixing, and it didn't have whatever the right direction, whatever it is. But it just felt like a lot of the same problems were on all of these projects, but some of them happen to work out and some of them don't. And I'm sure there are a million reasons why one might work out and one might not, but it's pretty astonishing that when you're in the thick of it, you might not know until like 2 months out if your game is going to be a disaster or not. I was just talking to two different people on the same AAA game, a game that's in production now, and one of them was like, at our current schedule, like this is going to be a disaster, and the other was like, oh well, I just found out our current schedule and I actually think it's going to shape up pretty well. So it's really like you just have no clue, and that to me is wild. I mean, again, is this just the nature of game development, that it's going to be all these disparate pieces and nobody's really going to have a coherent view because there's no way to put it all together until the very last minute, until everything, all the bugs are fixed and everything is online? Or are there better ways to do this? And I don't know. I mean, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, it reminds me of two other disciplines. One is film. The famous quote from the screenwriter William Goldman, who said nobody knows anything, right? And that's kind of like, he'd been making movies for so many years, and great acclaimed movies, but like at the end of the day, will it work or not? Will it come together? People still don't quite have the answer. And so I think some of that is maybe endemic to just the creative process. When you throw a bunch of people together and you try to make something creative, there is really sometimes an element of like, will this really work or not? The other discipline I was reminded of is the theater. A lot of people who work in the game industry, especially in the non-programming, well, both even in the programming side too, are people who are interested in the theater or who did theater in school and things like that.
Or obsessed with Sleep No More.
Or obsessed with Sleep No More and interactive theater and things like that. But there's a very strong strain of theater that runs through the game industry. And the thing that I always think about when you were saying like the game comes together at the very last moment and it's hard to tell, it reminds me of the dress rehearsal. The dress rehearsal is kind of famously always almost a disaster, and things don't go right. The dress rehearsal is like sort of your last big rehearsal before opening night. And the dress rehearsal, like all these problems happen and people flub their lines and drop props and whatever, all the set falls over, whatever, everything goes wrong during the dress rehearsal, and then supposedly magically on opening night everything works. And it's like this miracle, because it's suddenly all of the elements that were supposed to work before suddenly work together for the very first time, and it always takes until the last minute. I've definitely felt that energy before that you're talking about, and knowing that the theater has worked that way for however long, with that kind of energy, makes me a little bit curious about the statement of like, well, we just have to fix the problems with game development, because like, yes, we do, but at the same time, like, look at how people have been creating these creative products, right, for hundreds of years. It's always been such a struggle. It always comes up to the last minute. It always seems to hang on a thread a lot of times. So I guess you could say I definitely think that there are problems in the game industry that we should address, and you do a very good job of addressing them or talking about them in the book. But there's that other just kind of like, that ethereal element of like, this is a creative product, and there's something ineffable about it, I guess. I don't want to like mystify it too much, right? I was a producer. I should be a little bit more hard-edged about things.
More logistically.
I can't just be like, it'll be fine, whatever.
But here's the difference between game making and the two disciplines that you mentioned, film and theater. In film, you know how a movie is made. In theater, you know how a production is made. A film, you are essentially, I mean, there might be technical differences between sets, but like, you write a screenplay, like you point the camera at some things, you get your production crew together, you shoot, you edit it, like it always works the same way. It always follows a linear form. In theater, same thing, right? You get everyone together, they all memorize their lines, you get them in costume, you put them up on stage. The minutiae are going to be different every time, but like essentially you know how these things are made. In games, it's like that, it's all that, except also the engineers decided they want to build their own version of this middleware that is perfectly functional somewhere else, but like they think they can do it better this time. and suddenly you guys are rewriting the entire engine and have to rewrite all of the tools, and so nobody can actually do anything for months on end because the tools are broken, and it takes 8 hours to compile something, and it's just one giant headache after another, and suddenly you're on this 3-year project, and then you're crunching to finish everything in the last minute. So
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, I
Hmm.
think that to me is such a big difference, because you have in game development so many creative people who can't actually translate a lot of that creativity into game development because the tools are often so difficult to work with, and like like they're being made while you're working on the game.
Right.
And so I guess that, I think, makes it even more of a crapshoot that the magic will all come together. And so sure, maybe there's no way, maybe it's inevitable that there will always be that like spark at the end, and that'll be what there will be some chemistry that transforms a piece of art into something great. But with games, I think that like game productions just introduce more and more problems to the equation. And like, I'm not an engineer. I'm not going to sit here and say like, actually, you should be doing it this way. But it seems to me that like, at least from what I've heard, a lot of the times that conversation of like, oh, we're building our own tools because we have to, we want to do our own engine, we want to do our own production here. It just seems like it causes more trouble than anything else.
Right. Well, you don't hear about the times. I'll just say this, and then I think we'll move on to questions.
Yeah.
But so submit your questions in the little Q&A box,
Mm-hmm.
please.
Mm-hmm.
But so I was going to say, like, you may not. That is absolutely true. That new technology can be a huge risk, and people have compared it to shooting a film where you
Mm-hmm.
also build your own cameras, or putting on a play where you also have to build the theater. Right. Those are two great metaphors for what you were just
Yes.
talking about. Um, but there are also cases where the new technology really does pay off, right? And you don't really hear about them as much because it's like it worked the way it was supposed to, and
Mm-hmm.
now this cool AAA game does something that no game did before, right? Like
Yep.
that's the good version of that does happen sometimes. um and it's not always like the worst thing in the world, although it can
Yeah.
turn into that
Although
very
I'm sure
fast.
even in those cases, it was the worst thing for the people actually working on the game
Many times
because.
it was. I think to your point that like it hangs by a thread, and it can be very good or very bad.
Mm-hmm.
Very easily it can tip into one or the other, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Completely agree with that.
Yeah, sure. Let's take a couple of
All
reader
right.
questions.
So questions. First one is from Robert Gonzalez.
Mm-hmm.
What story are you most proud of working on?
Oh man, I don't know. I have a lot of stories that I'm proud of working on, I suppose. That's a hard question to answer. Um, I mean, I guess I'm pretty proud of the new book of Press Reset, and I've been happy with the buzz in it. And I don't have like a specific favorite story in it, but just like, kind of like telling the overarching story of this serious problem that is affecting the games industry, and trying to make it more public, and make people more aware of it. I guess I'm proud of that. I don't know what are you most proud of that you've done?
Me?
Yeah.
I think I because Eliza is the most recent thing that I worked on. I think I'm most proud of it, just because it's most,
Yeah,
it's
Eliza
my
is
recent
awesome.
memory.
Everyone should go play it. Really good.
It's also, yeah, it's also like it's a lot of stuff that I hadn't done before all together in one. So I guess I'm proud of that,
More games
as a
should be
story.
visual novels, in my humble
And it's a
opinion.
visual novel, yeah. So it was a really interesting experience for me to put that together.
Are
Um,
you gonna make another one? Are you gonna make another visual novel?
maybe, maybe we'll
That'd be
see.
cool.
Um,
You should do
next,
one about an attorney who is really ace at his job.
yeah, I'll call it Good Attorney. Okay, so TS asks, currently in grad school, this past fall, I met with Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, all of which were hiring for VR, AR in games and education. I can't help but feel like these 3D tech fields are still a fad. Do you think the future of games lies in this new beyond screen space?
No, absolutely not. Definitely a fad. I'm with you
All right
there.
then.
No, I mean, no, I think fat is unfair to say, especially about VR. AR maybe. I don't, it's hard to say with AR because we haven't really seen anything like other than Pokemon Go, anything use it in a commercial way, really, in a successful way. Even like HoloLens seems to have disappeared from Microsoft's radar. So, but VR is definitely its own little viable industry. But I think rather than seeing it as a fad, I always just saw it as kind of supplemental to gaming as a whole, and it'll always just be there for like the niche audience that wants VR stuff. But I doubt it will ever break into the mainstream, and it certainly won't be the future of games.
I think I would add to that and say, like, if you get good at making games, then you'll be good no matter what. Like whatever
Mm,
kind of shape that games take in the future, whether they
mm-hmm.
are these kind of more connected experiences or more console experiences, whatever type of thing that the things take in the future. If you kind of study games on their own, I think you'll be well served in like
Yeah,
these different types.
that's a better answer to what TS actually wants to know.
Anonymous asks, are there any studios that are particularly well equipped to make the positive changes you propose in the book? I don't know
Yeah,
if you want to call out some.
well, I don't know. I'm curious to hear your take. But so I like every time I hear something good about a studio, I feel like the other shoe always drops. Like for years I had heard from people at Ubisoft that it was that they really enjoyed working there and they felt really stable and happy. And then suddenly last summer we get this giant reckoning and it turns out that Ubisoft is full of abusive creeps. So it's tough for me to call out names specifically. But that said, I think that smaller studios are well equipped and or studios that are kind of progressive minded and would be open to something like a union, and I think I wouldn't be shocked if we saw like one of the some studio that is more, I don't know, radical in certain ways, like organize first and be the first one to do it. Like I wouldn't be shocked if Riot Games, for example, was the first studio to organize. And there's another example of a studio that like for a lot of people was really awesome and also had this like culture of sexism and awful stuff. But Riot Games seems like the type of studio that, or even a smaller one, might be the first one to do it. I don't know, but I'm very curious to see. Well, do you have any thoughts on this? Like you have a lot of
Yeah,
friends at a lot of studios.
I do, but I don't really get a read on like what they're going to. I don't. I feel like I don't really have a lot of visibility into that. I think
Yeah, to
that
whether they'll make positive changes. Yeah.
right, exactly. Like any studio that it's a lot of studios want to do the right thing, but then like they run out of money or their back is up against the wall and they
Hmm.
have to crunch anyway because they just don't have the funds coming in or things like that, right? So sometimes it's a matter of like good intentions, but then running up against reality and then deciding you want to save the company rather than just saying, hey, we can't really pay everybody what they're worth or
Yeah.
whatever. So
Yep.
I think it's just a matter of like paying attention to um, what you can see and I don't know. It's pretty fluid, I would say.
Hmm.
One question from Parkia. The development period of AAA games has been growing a lot in recent years. Do you think decreasing the scope of games in terms of content and a faster development cycle can help with some of the issues that you discussed?
Yeah, I do think that could help. I don't think it'll happen in AAA because AAA is trending up and more expensive and bigger. And I mean, games are about to be $70, and so they're going to be expected to be full of more stuff than ever before, like 200 hours instead of just 150. So I don't think that's ever going to happen. But yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that like if games were made at a smaller scale in a more sustainable way, in with smaller development cycles, I think that could definitely help. That said, Naughty Dog, a company that's really known for having a pretty brutal crunch culture, they made a smaller game called Lost Legacy, Uncharted Lost Legacy, and by many accounts, that was like one of the worst projects they've ever had from a production standpoint, from a crunch standpoint, from everything. So sometimes it can backfire if you have an ambitious studio that's trying to do something smaller and they wind up fitting in as much as possible because it's just in their nature to like stuff it full of stuff. Then I think that can go the other way. But I do think that like from a sustainability standpoint, just releasing smaller stuff and like doing things that are more at a smaller scale in a more sustainable way, I think could be really helpful for game companies, especially the smaller ones that don't have to worry as much about like, are we going to make a $70 game? So
Yeah, I for one would love more AA games, 15
Mhm.
hours, small team.
It'd be
Like I think that would
nice.
be
Yeah.
that's great for your own time too.
Yes, I feel like most of the best games I've played over the past couple of years have been smaller scale games that were not 400 hours long.
So I think okay, I'll do one more question.
Okay.
It's from Robert Gonzalez again. It's, if you're wanting to start writing gaming news, do you have any recommendations on where to start, or resources,
Um,
places you can show up and say, hey, I'm interested
hey,
in
I want
starting
to be
writing?
yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I wouldn't recommend doing that because it's not a great it's not a particularly, I mean, you want to talk about like unstable jobs, media, and especially gaming media is up there. But yeah, I mean, the same way you would do anything, network and hustle and pitch yourself and try to get your foot in the door in whatever way you can. And one of the things that people might not realize in the gaming media space is that most gaming sites are open to freelance pitches from pretty much anyone. So you can just reach out to people and try to get your foot in the door that way. But yeah,
Are
be
there any
persistent.
particular like beats or stories or angles that you think are particularly interesting right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like one of the things that I always recommend to people when they ask me like how do I get into journalism, how do I get into gaming journalism, whatever, is to specialize. I think specialization is really important. And maybe this is true of any industry, but I think it's really important to like not just be like, I mean, at first you can certainly be like, I want to explore all the different things and do every possible type of writing and figure out what I'm good at. But at the end of the day, like a few years into your career, I think the goal should be, what am I really, really good at? And how can I make myself known as like the best person at this, or like a really good person at this? Because you kind of want to build like a brand, quote unquote, for yourself, and not just to the public, but also to like people who are in positions to hire you and to give you work, and just like make yourself the reliable person for like the esports reporting person, or like the reviews of strategy games person, or whatever it is. I think that can be helpful for a long-term career. And I'm sure it's
Mhm.
true in game development as well. Like if you were known as the best lighter, then you will get a lot of calls, as opposed to being someone who's just kind of a jack of all trades.
Rigging is the thing you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
There's always a rigging and effects. Tech
Nice.
art,
Good to
basically.
know.
Anything that's kind of
Yeah,
tech
tech
art
art.
is like, you'll always want that. It's like being a
Yeah.
drummer. Like every band needs a drummer. So,
Good
um,
comparison. Good note to end this on. Tech art is
yeah,
like being a drummer.
yeah. It's the backbone of the secret backbone. All right.
Well, hello.
Hello.
My background disappeared. I'm not sure how that happened, but that's
no.
okay. So this was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you both for being here. Robert in the chat says, thank you so much. This was awesome and insightful. And I totally agree. There's so much that I didn't know about this topic. Audience members, thank you so much for being here. As always, definitely follow those links. Go check out, I linked Eliza too. Definitely go look into that and go check out that book. You can either order it online, or as always, come on in. We would love to see you if you are local. As always, let us know what you thought. Come say hi to a bookseller or tweet us. Either way works. We'd love to hear from you. And I think that is all I have. So thank you both one more time for being here. And I think it is time for us to awkwardly wave.
All right. Thanks,
All right, bye
everyone.
guys. Thank
Bye.
you.
Good night, everyone.